Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Sanders, English Language Arts Program Manager here at the Department of Education. And I just wanted to thank you all for attending our last live webinar session. I had not planned to be here with you, but when I realized this was the last one, I wanted to come and thank all of you, especially those of you who have been with us throughout the series. While this is our last live session, we will have a recorded session done in collaboration with Georgia Public Broadcasting and the High Museum that will be featured in April. And that's our visual literacy segment, and Cassandra will talk more about that. But I just wanted to come in and say good morning and thank you for attending. Thank our presenters for their expertise, as well as thank Cassandra and Sherilyn, who are working quietly behind the scenes to make this happen. Again, thank you, and we hope you enjoyed today's presentation.
Hello, everyone. As Stephanie said, we welcome you this morning to our collaborative conversations on building a culture of writing. Before we start the live conversation, we do invite you to start and continue the conversation on Twitter. Be sure to use the hashtag Culture of Writing at Godot ELA. Today, as Stephanie mentioned, is the sixth 612 session entitled Digital Literacy. And in this session today, you'll deepen your understanding of digital literacy and consider innovative ways to engage students in the practice of analyzing and composing information using digital devices. Again, we're excited to welcome Dr. Darren Krovitz and Heather Barton as they share research and best practices for digital literacy in grades 6 through 12. Before their session begins, we would like to begin by briefly hearing from our colleague, Dee Bunn, who will review the principles for universal design for learning. And we encourage you to keep these principles in mind as you hear from today's presenters and prepare to plan instruction to meet the needs of all students. Dee?
Good morning. Okay, we're checking the clicker. We might see if that's working again. Okay. There we go. Okay. As a part of developing your lesson plans for students, one of the challenges that you face is planning for the learning needs of a wide variety of students. One framework that has shown some promising success in this endeavor is Universal Design for Learning. Briefly, Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, is a framework that allows teachers to build strategies and techniques into their lesson plans that not only reduce any possible barriers to students in instruction and learning, but also provides flexibility in the ways that you can engage students, present information to your students, and ways that students can respond to show their grasp of the information that you're providing. In order to provide that flexibility, UDL utilizes a framework of 3 principles. These principles are based in the neuroscience of how individuals learn and are the basis of UDL. These principles allow teachers to develop multiple means of engaging students to create purposeful and motivated learners, multiple means of representing the information that students need to learn, providing different ways for them to perceive material, process and comprehend the material that you're presenting. And lastly, multiple ways that they are learning and ways they can express their knowledge. As you listen to today's webinars, keep in mind these 3 principles and how you might use them to develop a lesson plan that will help you reach all of your students. You can find additional information on UDL and assistive technology by the link provided on this slide. This link will also give you access to the recording of this webinar. At the end of the webinar, we'll review the 3 principles and tie the information that you received today into those principles. And here is a clicker for you guys.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, thank you everybody for being a part of this. We'll go ahead and introduce ourselves. My name is Darren Krovitz. I've been at Kennesaw State University now for 12 years. I teach in the English education program there, and I predominantly work with people who are going to be English teachers, pre-service English teachers, but I also work with experienced English teachers as well who are coming back to school to get their graduate degrees. Part of our curriculum, both at the initial certification level and at the advanced level is a course on digital media and technology. And so the kinds of questions and topics that we're going to be talking about in this session are something that we try to grapple with within our programs as well. So I'll leave it at that, and I think we'll touch on a lot of these things as we go through the presentation.
And I'm Heather Barton. I'm at Etowah High School in Cherokee County, and I teach predominantly 11th grade students in the ELA department, AP English Language, and Advanced Composition. I have a love for digital literacy in the classroom, and I'd love to see what students can do with it.
Okay, let's see if we get the slide to move forward here. There we go. Okay, so the focus of this this webinar is digital literacies and media literacies, and so that plural on the noun there might be worth talking about. And presumably, if you're taking part in this webinar, if you've seen some of the other webinars, you're probably familiar with this idea of multiple literacies, right? And so when I hear literacy in the conventional sense, I think of print-based reading and writing. Yes. I think that's what most English teachers probably think about. That if you're literate, then you can read print-based texts, and you can create your own print-based text. You can write. Right. Mm-hmm. But with recent developments, and especially in technology and with the rise of the internet, what it means to read and write is changing. Through those tools that technology has provided for us. And so as we go through here, I think our goal here with this presentation is to both provide a framework for talking about the scope of these concepts with some questions that have been helpful to us, and then we're going to look at some practical applications of those questions and those approaches. But one thing to start with that may be helpful is that if we think about a text as not just being a print-based text, but as something that can move beyond that into digital spaces. I think that's...
Yeah, I definitely think that that's one of the most interesting parts, is students tend to see literacy as something that they can control and that they can manipulate, and that's exciting.
Okay, so the first thing we thought we'd ask you to do is to think about this term digital literacies and what this phrase might mean to you. And so we'll give you a few minutes there to respond. There are multiple ways to do so. You can tweet or you can use the chat feature. And then we'll take it from there. Okay. So one of the books, or one of the resources that we've used is this book right here. It's Understanding Digital Literacies by Hafner and Jones. So we're going to pull a little bit conceptually from that book and talking about digital literacies and what they might entail. And so if we go back to that idea of, well, new technology and tools have changed how we write and how we read, if we explore that concept a little bit, we might be able to recognize that there are different forms of communication out there now that didn't exist just a few decades ago, right? And so here are a couple on the slides. New ways to communicate, we have things such as blogging, modding, memeing, mashing, and these may not be terms that you're that familiar with. I'm pretty sure everybody's heard about blogging, and we are probably familiar with memeing. If you have any kind of social network presence, right, you'll see various kinds of visual memes pop up, and we'll look at some in a little bit. And these all represent new ways of communicating that, again, didn't exist just a little while ago. And so when we talk about digital literacies and what these tools enable us to do, we can think of them as a set of new skills or ways of thinking or ways of interacting or ways of communicating meaning that our young people, our students, are engaged with already. And so it's been proposed that perhaps English teachers might include these kinds of literacies as part of what they do.
Especially the memeing. My students love to respond to me in memes. So I post a question and they give me a meme back. So I have to understand what that meme means before I can actually understand what they're saying to me, which is a very interesting take on that.
So what kinds of new skills are we talking about here when it comes to both the tools and the online spaces and online affordances that technology is allowing? And so here's a list, right? And this is again drawn from the Hafner and Jones text, and it's not necessarily a complete list. And many of these things you'll probably be familiar with as, yeah, that's something that you should probably know how to do, and that will benefit you as you communicate and interact in these kinds of online ways and spaces. So let's go through these and talk briefly about them. Searching through and evaluating lots of information.
Yeah, from an AP Lang teacher's mindset, that is a huge thing. Teaching students from a very early age how to search through, find something that's credible, use it for whatever their meme or whatever their medium is super important skill, so that by the time they get to me in the 11th and 12th grade, they know how to navigate those, and we don't have to have a conversation of what makes a source legitimate, what makes a source relevant to what they're doing.
And you know, searching and evaluating has obviously been part of conventional English language arts for a long time. There have been research, we do research papers, we do research writing and projects. But you know, when I did that as a student, I went to the library, and it meant how do I negotiate, you know, the library's sorting system to find what I wanted. Now we go online, and we have to have a set of ways of thinking about information and organizing information and curating information. It's an interesting word, curate, right? There's a sense of responsibility there that I have to decide for myself what information is relevant to my needs. That's pretty high level stuff, right? That's a high level skill to have. All right, number two, hyperlinking to shape reading or viewing experience. We use Google Drive almost exclusively now in our English Ed classes at Kennesaw State, which allow us to do things like hyperlink documents between one another to help our students grapple with this idea that how you present information to students can really be different, and that hyperlinks allow you to move through different kinds of documents and texts in a way that you simply didn't do or couldn't do previously. So you may be familiar with Google Classroom, or there are other kinds of similar spaces, cloud-based spaces. Different schools and different districts have signed on to explore those. I think that's still in its infancy somewhat. What are the new skills? Number three, creating and editing photos and video, and we can combine that probably with the next one, creating digital text that combine words, graphics, video, and audio. It's so easy to do this now. You don't need a degree in media production to create videos, right? You can have an app on your phone to do these things. You don't have to have much expertise to move into that realm and start creating, sharing, and communicating. And so we want to be able to help our students with the kinds of questions to ask when they're doing that, so they can do so effectively and ethically, right? Intentionally. Intentionally is huge, yeah. 5, maintaining online profiles and managing social networks. Wow. I think that teachers and parents probably look at that one and say, that's kind of a negative thing. Like, I want less social networking in my life, especially for young people. But the fact of the matter is that this is part of our lives now, and we can think about this and help students think about ways to organize their identity purposefully online, both in ways to protect themselves, but also in ways to present themselves to the world, right? These are, if you're thinking about who you are as a professional. You're going to college. You're going into a career of some kind. What does that mean? How do you present yourself to the world? Number 6, navigating online spaces and interacting virtually. It's kind of similar to number 5 as well. I think it's clear that if you've used online platforms, all of us have, if we've been in online spaces, there are conventions that come along with that involvement that require you to understand the moves that you're expected to make, right? And they're different according to context. And number 7, protecting one's personal data and reputation. Obviously important, and obviously something that could be intentional. All right, so we have some questions.
They're asking about Google Drive almost exclusively at KSU. Would you expand on that? They want to know more about the purpose.
Sure, and when I say we use it exclusively, I'll narrow that down and say in the English Ed program for our English Ed majors and the courses that we teach in that program. And so we have probably similar to what many schools have, which is a content management system that the state has approved, which is Desire to Learn. I think that's what it's still called.
Yeah,
it changes its name all the time. I worked with Blackboard and other kinds of similar systems. So our goal in preparing English teachers is to be nimble and to be able to use technology in a way that's going to help your future students grapple with these questions. And so we try to stay away, and it's probably not good to say necessarily since it's the approved content management system, but I don't use Desire to Learn that much. I keep my grades there for students to access in a safe space, but we build our courses out virtually using Google Drive because it's such a flexible and easy to use system, and I want our students who will be teachers to be able to have access and experience with doing the same thing that is not proprietary, meaning that if I teach you to learn how to use this smartboard, if I teach you to learn how to use this content management system, it may not be the smartboard or content management system that you have in a school. So what's more important is kind of an approach or a stance or perspective toward what this technology can do for you.
And as a teacher, my teaching partner and I both went through KSU together, and we've adopted that within our own classrooms. So we manage everything through Google Drive as well. Students collaborate in that space. They talk to each other about their writing, their calendar, all of their materials, handouts, everything is online. I don't print out anymore. They have to go and find it, so I'm really trying to make that transition for them to a college-based type of environment where they have to be more independent and more willing to go and dig and find that information. And it's very, very helpful. Students really, at first, are resistant, but now they rely on it. They'll say, that folder's not ready. I'm like, make a folder. And they feel more independent and able to use and manipulate our space online, for a better way of saying it.
And we used Drive when we were putting this presentation together. You know, I didn't start creating a PowerPoint and then attach that PowerPoint to an email and send it to Heather. That's kind of 1990s, right?
It is.
The trouble with that is that who's got the most recent edition of the PowerPoint, and especially if you're sending it to multiple people. Well, with cloud-based platforms like Google Drive, the presentation lives in the cloud, right? And it's always the most up-to-date, right? And you can share, set sharing settings however you like, editing, viewing, private. It's just a lot more efficient to work through documents.
Definitely.
And even administratively in our English Ed program, much of the administrative side is moved into the cloud. It's just a lot better than having something locked on someone's hard drive. Right?
I think that's it,
All right, so we continue. Okay. Okay, so we understand, and I think we've grappled ourselves with the challenges and in some cases the fears of moving into new realms of making meaning and dealing with new tools, especially with technology. So there is a natural kind of fear that comes along. And I think teachers feel that, but that's normal. It's normal that when you have a new tool or new way of making meaning or communicating, that there's going to be some resistance to that. It's been that way for thousands of years as these images maybe hint at. So if we go back to the days of Plato and Socrates, the big threat there was writing, believe it or not. Because writing, if you wrote something down, that means you didn't have to memorize it, so that you weren't using your brain. And so the big worry at the time was that this was a terrible development, and that
Yes.
as we see here, it's an inhuman thing to write. I like the cartoon about chipping rocks.
Yes.
You know, we see that now in our own modern ways. Manners and morals. You see that comic books were a big deal 50 or 60 years ago. That was the moral worry at the time, and then of course there's a current moral panic about what the internet may or may not be doing to our minds. So we've overcome previous fears. We'll probably overcome these as well.
Teacher worries are definitely just an issue that all of us deal with. I do myself, and I love technology and I embrace it completely, but I see my colleagues that are fearful of what it does, and I think the best piece of advice I can give you is to learn alongside your student. They will teach you what it is that they need to know. Be willing to be wrong in the classroom. There have been several times that I've tried out a piece of technology and it's fallen flat, and the students are like, let's scrap that, let's go back to this. So I think that you just have to be willing and comfortable with putting yourself out there, not being the expert in the room, and allowing the students to kind of navigate that field, and they will. They love to experiment.
Yeah, and so they're saying part of these fears are located in our identities as teachers and what we see our role as being in the classroom. And if we see ourselves as being experts, as having to have a stable, expert body of knowledge in order to teach something, then yeah, we're going to be worried when it comes to new tech advances. There's just no way you can keep up, right? But so this raises the question: do you need to be the expert in order to have explorations in these areas? I don't think you do.
No, I don't think so. A perfect example of this is we recently did in-class debates, and I wanted something that was very similar to the presidential debates, where it was a poll and they could see whether they were resonating with their audience or not with their arguments. And the students, I set them free and said, find me something that does this. And they came back with a product that did it. We played with it. It worked perfectly. I didn't have time to research that. They wanted to. They were passionate about it, and they made it work.
Yeah. If you can reimagine what your role is, and say, I'm a learner among 30 other learners, 35, maybe 40, whatever it may be. I'm a learner among learners, and the concept of crowdsourcing, to say that many of you probably know more than I do in this area, and we're going to leverage that knowledge that you all have to become more of a community and trying to grapple with what these tools or what these platforms or what these spaces allow us to do, right? In terms of composing something, creating something. And so this idea of adjusting your pose as a teacher, I think, is important. Be willing to experiment, know that things won't always go right, and share that with students, and come at this from a slightly different angle. We've done some work with this. Heather was in one of my classes a few years ago, and this is the approach I try to take too. You know, I did the assignments. There were 4 major projects where we were investigating the use of particular digital tools, and I set myself up as a participant in this as well. There were people in the class who were better at it than I was. I created products as well. Granted, it was a graduate class with adults, but I think that that's a model that can work when you're investigating potentials of digital tools. Okay, and so we grapple with this as well. You know, when we're going into a big field or a big area like digital literacies, it's like, where do I begin? How do I even make sense? Where do I start? We found it helpful to think of it in these kinds of terms. First of all, as tools. What do tools do? They mediate our experience, meaning that they exist between and facilitate our interactions. And so there are obviously thousands of different kinds of tools, and there are some examples there. And when something mediates an experience, it shifts the meaning around and narrows the meaning in some ways, and expands it in others. So if we can think about it that every tool, whether it's a digital tool or a physical tool, has something that it allows you to do, right? It gives you an affordance. It allows you to do something, but it also constrains you in some way. There are things you can't do with the tool. And so some examples of this, there's always the joke that if you, or the saying that if you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? If your only tool is a hammer, then that allows you to do certain things, but other things you simply can't do effectively with just that one tool. A car is a great example. Obviously, automobiles and the invention of the automobile has created a lot of positive impacts and effects in terms of what it allows people to do and how people can interact and live their lives. But we drove down here through morning traffic
Yes.
in a car, and it's very apparent how that particular tool has transformed what it means to live with other people or interact with other people. There are probably thousands of people that we interacted with on the road that really it wasn't an interaction at all. They're all strangers in metal boxes.
We all get there.
Right, so we can see there's an affordance to a car, but there's also a constraint in human relationships that cars present. So let's play with this idea a little bit of affordances and constraints. Here's an activity. We'll take a few minutes to think about this. What affordances and constraints are associated with the following tools? Just maybe choose one or choose another one if you don't like any of those, and tweet or post your responses to this. What do they allow you to do, and how do they constrain what you can do?
Okay. If I had to pick one that I think is kind of changed for me in teaching, it would probably be the school supply teacher webpage. So we started with a very visual public presence of a web page that had to be updated consistently. You had to make sure everything was on there. There was a clear way that it had to be maintained. There were a lot of affordances that way. Students could get to the materials quickly. Parents could see what was happening in the classroom. The constraints would be that everything that I made my intellectual property was out there for anybody to take and use on their own without any kind of conversation. Now it's more in-house. It's through a learning management system. It's more controlled. And I would say the constraint still is what I just complained about, is that I can't have my colleagues look at my information and start a conversation about the property that I create. So it goes back and forth both ways for me.
And I think that's often the case when schools begin their initial forays into online spaces or online tools. It's very cautious of a movement. Right? And so you may have something that's kind of like a web page, but it has all these limitations built around it because of safety and security issues. Perhaps understandable that that's the case. Twitter, yeah. Obviously there are affordances with Twitter. The president has used those affordances, as we all know. And you can communicate directly, very quickly with many people. The constraints are probably obvious with Twitter. You're limited to 140 characters. Right?
You are always rewriting and getting it in that 140 characters.
And you know, I've seen a series of Twitter posts where you, what do they call that?
I've heard somebody use it the other day, and I can't remember.
Yeah, it's like a Twitter
like
essay.
7 of them that you could follow along.
So if you want to do a longer, more complex statement on Twitter, you basically have to let people know in advance that what's coming now are 10 Twitter posts that represent a paragraph. So for its affordances, it also comes with constraints. And so this idea of, you know, whatever the tool may be, it allows us to do something, and it restricts us from doing something as well. I think this is helpful if we can introduce students to this concept when it comes to digital tools or digital spaces or digital platforms. The tendency in our culture is to take up technology as an automatic good thing. right? It's something that's making our lives better. But we want to develop with ourselves as teachers, but also with students, a critical capacity to ask these kinds of questions. What does this allow me to do? What does it prevent me from doing? Okay, there's a response, or a reply from Tara. Smartphones afford us a wealth of information, but constrain us in terms of being able to evaluate it all. That's great. You know, you have the internet in your pocket with a smartphone, and there's an obligation almost that comes along with that, like, oh, I've got to keep checking the smartphone and my email and my posts, and so the smartphone ends up kind of owning you sometimes, right? That you're the tool. The smartphone is the...
Especially students.
Yeah.
It's a daily battle.
And again, that's a matter of sort of a critical awareness to say, how do I use this tool wisely? How do I use this tool effectively and not let the constraints of the tool warp my own interaction with it? On the next slide here, just like this quotation from Neil Postman, who's a cultural critic and writer, and he was kind of ahead of his time. And so he has something similar to say about technology. For every advantage technology offers, there's always a disadvantage. He also said that every new technology is at war with the technology it replaces, which kind of seems true, right? When email came along, it's like, you don't really write letters anymore, physical letters, do you? Yeah, so, and that there's, with every new technology or tool, there's a bias, right? There's inherent biases in technology, and issues of equity, issues of access, who has the tool, who has the ability to get the tool and use the tool, that we tend to not look at when we take up these things. So what are we getting at, right? It's the ability to be critically literate and to ask these kinds of questions about whatever technology, whatever tool students are using. What does it allow you to do? What does it allow you not to do? What are its advantages and disadvantages? Okay, so let's turn to talk about a little bit about what this actually looks like in the classroom, how it can be put into practice.
So I love to just set my students free and give them very specific parameters, but how they create those parameters is up to them. So you see a series of images here. One in the middle is a video we'll play for you in just a second. On the very right and in the middle is a reaction from a freshman class where I told them to pick a specific character or a specific scene within Romeo and Juliet and make it come to life. How they did that was up to them. I did have students choose to go old school with scissors and paper, and they created some great collages. But the two on the right are examples of the one in the middle is students reenacting the love scenes of Romeo and Juliet, and it includes a balcony scene that they recorded. I did not tell them how to record it. They took their phones, they found an app, they put music to it, they made it all their own, including the literature book that helped them marry each other, which is crazy. And then one on the right, they were really fascinated with Juliet and her character development. So they took selfies of her character development throughout the play and portrayed that, which is pretty amazing as well. On the left are my seniors, and they love to create podcasts. This group loves anything with a podcast. Put a mic in front of them. They create and write a script collaboratively on a digital space. Then they use that to record and then put out to the student body the recording that they made in the podcast of the material. So it's pretty fascinating to watch them navigate that.
Anywhere I would have followed you.
So of course there's affordances and constraints to this type of video. They're all over the school playing. It looks like they're not engaged. How do we show the suicide scene but not make it graphic? All of these are images that they had to navigate and figure out what was important, how they could explore that. But after they do any of these types of projects, the next most important piece is that they have to write a reflection of why they chose, what they chose, how they chose it, and what it made possible for them in that medium.
And that reflective piece, it's so important because it's hard to know when you're looking at creative projects that use technologies, tools that you may not be that familiar with. How do you judge quality? Right? How do you say this meets the expectation, or this meets the standards, or this meets the expectation that you demonstrate your learning? It's really hard to do when you give students choice. Then that becomes a lot more ambiguous. And so if you ask them to write about what they did, write about the moves they make, why they made those choices, that's something that you can evaluate, I think, more conventionally, but you can be assured, right, of intention.
Yeah, so I'm looking at collages, and I'm looking at this video that's obviously, you know, totally different. The reflective piece is what I'm actually examining more than the artistic piece that they create, because that explains to me their learning. That explains to me their intention.
And if we can weave in some of these framework type of questions and critical awareness, then that can be something that we ask students to think about as they talk about what they did and why they used the tools that they did.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here's a slide for questions. So we'll pause briefly if you have any questions so far about anything we've been talking about.
All right, so we've got a comment here that says, I love the addition of writing at the end because it allows students to reflect in writing about what they have done. Excuse me. Yes, that for me as an English teacher is the key. That allows me to interact with them and be a part of the process of them making it, but also to sit down with them and see exactly why they made the choices they made.
I'm teaching a class of really just an introductory class for pre-service English teachers, and we were talking about this the other day. That really you can take this tactic with any kind of work that students produce. You know, if you ask students to write an essay in class, a conventional literary analysis essay, I'm asking the same questions as a teacher. How can I be assured that students are really demonstrating that they've learned something? You can get an essay off the internet, as we all know. Someone else can write the essay for you. So how am I more assured that you understand? It's almost like I want to see a reflection written about the moves made in the essay as well, and that's what I want to assess rather than the essay itself.
Yes. That's a very good point. From Twitter, sometimes service and firewalls in schools pose a constraint. Our students are required to be on Wi-Fi. Sometimes that creates a lot of constraints to what we're doing, and they have to figure out how to navigate that world where it is constrained, but there's something available to them. It takes some trial and error and some patience on the student part, to be honest.
Yeah, and that's a real, it can strain your patience maybe if you're trying to be innovative as a teacher. But you know, change is happening. It's changed a lot since I've been at Kennesaw State. There's a lot more districts that have bring your own technology policies. They've opened up the process by which you can say, look, this website, for instance, or this tool online has a use for us, shouldn't be blocked. Districts are, I think, becoming a little more nimble in how they handle these kinds of things. Okay, we'll move along. And so the idea of multimodal composition, and again, we sort of alluded to this earlier, that there are more ways to make meaning communicated than just through print. And when we reflect on this, we think it's probably obvious, right?
Yeah, that top right photo is probably my first foray into digital media and what it looked like in the classroom. You have a traditional textbook, you have a laptop, and they're navigating, writing an essay or responding to questions together. Then you see kind of what that looks like on the platform I use, which is Google Drive. What I love about this, Office 365, any of those types of products out there, is it allows students to provide feedback in writing, and that's what you see on the right side of the written page. I find students provide more feedback in this situation than when they sit down next to each other in the traditional sense and they read somebody's paper and they go, sounds good, and give it back. Leaving a specific comment on a piece of paper that someone then will see It requires them to think a little bit more deeply about what it is they're saying, the feedback that they're giving. And then on the left is my AP Language classroom. We recently listened to a podcast together, Serial. They listened to it completely outside of class. In class, they navigated and negotiated what were the important parts of the text to analyze. And they wrote up a script. They created a map of what they wanted to do on the digital platform. And this is the result. It's huge. It takes up a whole wall in my classroom of their response to the text. And it's just, it amazes me still.
I just love this assignment. Serial, that podcast, is a great text that will engage students. It's about a murder, high school students, and it deals with the realities of being young today. So it's definitely a challenging text in some ways, but obviously one that offers a lot of potential engagement.
And what I loved about this assignment is each class had to work together. So this is not one or two students. This is a class of 30 students who each had a specific task involved in it, and they were competing against the other classes. They all looked at the text differently. They all examined it differently, but they all came back individually into one group mosaic of what they saw within the text.
And multimodal composition is not a new concept for the English classroom, right? We've had students create posters in the past. You don't need technology necessarily as we normally think of it to do such things. But with the affordances of apps, digital tools, websites that make it very easy to incorporate image or film or sound along or hyperlinks with your text, there's just a lot more that can be done here. And we start asking questions like, okay, so what is the effect if I include an image here in the text and weaving it in some sort of way? How does this transform the meaning and how it's received by an audience, right? And those are pretty important questions. All right, the next slide. So part of the digital realm is obviously the entertainment, right? Games.
Here's my moral panic. It's
Sure. And so that's something obviously young people, or many of them, are very much engaged with. And so how do we leverage that?
So breakout rooms have become all the rage lately, and there's a product out there where teachers can buy a box and bring it into the classroom with locks that they have to navigate, negotiate to unlock. So I took that in a different way and looked at it from a digital standpoint and created a digital game that they had to do together to solve the digital locks and unlock. And it's all around one of the essays that they're writing. So as they're navigating the different locks and finding the clues, they're writing a collaborative essay together. So it pushes them to a totally different level of me lecturing, this is the essay, this is how you write it, getting prepared for the test. We never had a formal conversation about how to write this essay, but they know this essay better than they do the two I did formally. So I'm looking to game all of them now because that seemed to stick in their heads, which is a good thing.
The concept of gaming, if we can get past the idea that it's not serious and it's it's just superfluous or a waste of time or just frivolous. James G. is probably one of the big writers, the big researchers in this field, and has pointed out that, look, when you're playing a video game, you're learning. The game teaches you how to play it and how to be successful within the game, right? It
teaches you how to fail and continue on and not give up. Those are all part of it.
And look at how attracted students are to that kind of learning, right? That gamified kind of experience with learning. How do we take advantage of that, right, as teachers? And this is a great example.
It was messy, I will tell you that. It was very messy. They were all over the place, but it was fun.
All right, got some more questions?
Absolutely. If they could send me, so someone's asking if they can have access to an example, I'd be happy to share it with you. It's on Google Drive. If they can send us the email address, I'd be happy to share it with you. You can manipulate it however you like.
Interesting thing, I was talking to another teacher recently who was exploring this idea of games and how do you gamify your curriculum. And so a lot of modern video games have this element of collaboration where you're socially involved with other people with the game. In fact, you can't get past certain certain places in the game without collaborating with other users.
And that's exactly how this one is. There were parts of them that were definitely individual, and they had to answer themselves, but then they would get to a question where they could not pass without peers' help, which is awesome.
And you might say, well, that sounds a lot like group work, right? Like conventional group work. Well, kind of, but not really. I mean, unless you set it up that way, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and so another digital practice, we referred to this earlier, social networking. How do we leverage this new way of interacting and making meaning?
So I have a digital classroom on Twitter. It's called Barton AP Lang, and my students love to send me texts through that. So on the left you have an example of them finding rhetoric in use. So this is literally from a Lowe's or a Home Depot, I can't remember whichever one's red. And they found parallelism, but it wasn't, and it didn't work. And so they sent that tweet to me, which I thought was awesome. That, you know, they're walking through a home improvement store finding rhetoric in action. On the right, with our presidential debate, obviously that was a focus within our class. So we did rhetoric bingo during the debates, and this student represented Trump as the money bags and Hillary Clinton as the older woman, and you can see how this student navigated, okay, use this one, and across the board where she got her bingo. So it was that actually, I did that on the fly, just said, hey, let's try this. It was not attached to points, it was not attached to an assignment, and they loved it. They begged for it in all the other debates. When the debates were over, they said, can we continue? And I'm like, ow, what are we going to look at? Give me two people arguing. What are we going to watch? So there's talk about doing some town halls, which will be interesting.
Some other examples of social networking, or at least using the affordances of social networking, and you don't have to do this digitally. You can do an analog representation of this. As students, for example, creating the social networking account of a character, right? And so what would this character be tweeting about? And so that's a way for students to engage with something they're familiar with, perhaps, and show their understanding or knowledge of a text and a character through that depiction and the specific details they choose to include. I've seen that a few times, and it seems a pretty interesting way to approach character analysis. Revisioning conventional assignments, and so I think this is kind of how I've tended to approach this in my own forays into digital literacies, is, okay, how do I take what I'm currently doing and take some gradual steps here into revising it such that it's more relevant and takes advantage of some of the things that these new tech tools allow us to do. And so we might take something like the research project or the senior project, which is by and large still pretty conventionally imagined in schools, right? The research paper is something that teachers dread as much as students, probably. Yes. And so, yes. But there are efforts that have been made, and some advances and some transformations that are happening with things like the conventional research paper and senior projects.
Senior project is evolved in our county. We used to be completely paper-based, and now we are navigating into a more digital field. We went from binders that were the portfolio, and now the students have a digital space. But now we're grappling with how to protect students' rights through FERPA and making sure that we have a digital presence, but not necessarily everyone can get access to it. It's been a hard navigation.
Thank you, and we're back on the slide. That was my fault. Okay, and so let's take a look at memes, right? And you might say, well, why would I use a graphic or visual meme, some of the stuff that pops up on your social media feeds, social networking feeds? How can I use this to my advantage as a teacher? Okay, and so here's a typical visual meme. There are many of them. Some of them are not appropriate. I mean, this is a judgment call on your part as a teacher. I'm kind of fascinated by these because they have certain rules, right? So if you're going to create this particular condescending Willy Wonka meme, well, you have to follow the rules for how you create an example of this that's funny or that meets an audience's expectations. So what are the rules for this? Well, nobody's written these down, although there are meme analysis websites you can go to that try to explain how these work. So the top line of this particular meme, there's a question or a statement that Wonka is asking in a deceptively innocent fashion. And then the bottom line is a follow-up that's an ironic request or statement that reveals the hypocrisy or inanity or absurdity of the situation presented at the top line. That's pretty complex stuff for something that seems like a pretty simplistic text, right? And again, this is a realm that many students already have experience with. They're already doing this kind of thing. So can we, A, point out that this follows certain conventions, right? That if you're going to create one of these, you have to meet the expectations of an audience. And then can we use it in the classroom for some interesting purposes, right? And so here's an example. You like the Facebook status. Tell me more about how you love being a social activist, right? Slacktivism, that's called, right? I posted on it, and that's I'm doing my part. All right, so here's a couple other examples. So here's one. Oh, you manufactured a bad boy millionaire persona to woo a superficial party girl who dumped you earlier. Those must be wedding bells, I hear, right? You can hear the sarcasm. You can hear the irony. And irony is one of those things that students kind of struggle with.
They
right?
do. They really struggle with that. The subtleties of it sometimes. They can point to it, but they don't understand it in context. Yeah.
Which is ironic in itself, given how our culture is saturated with irony. And so you probably recognize this kind of sarcastic plot summary here of a classic work from American literature. Here's another one. So you're helping your friend escape slavery by heading south. Sounds like a well-thought plan. Okay. Another one. So you're constantly making up stories about yourself and pretending you're someone you're not. Tell me more about the phonies that surround you, right? That's maybe a criticism of Holden Caulfield. And, oh, your society outlawed books. You must be so well educated. And some of these we created. Some of these were created by students. And you can see that this is something that takes a little bit of practice, perhaps, to get the formula down. But these kinds of texts that are prevalent in digital spaces have rules, right? These follow rules, and we can use that to our advantage. Here's another visual meme, and so this is what people think I do, and how this is usually composed is that there is a job title at the top, or some facet of someone's identity, like student or American, in this case engineer, and then we have 6 images with what my mom thinks I do, what society thinks I do, what I tell people I do, that present different sides and different perspectives on that identity. I think this is kind of a fascinating tool for what it can help us realize about each other, but also about stereotypes and also about character analysis. So we've used this in different ways. Here's one from a kind of a lesser character from Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah, definitely.
Paris.
But one the students really enjoy talking about, so I love this one.
Yeah, and so Paris is, if you know R&J, he's, correct me if I'm wrong, he's the guy that the Capulets think that Juliet should marry, right? So we can also talk about his character from different perspectives. And so we have who society thinks I am, who Lord Capulet thinks I am. You may recognize that person in that photo. It's the young Mitt Romney. Who the nurse thinks I am, another character Juliet thinks I am, handcuffs and forcing me to get married. Romeo thinks I am a nobody, phony perhaps, and who I think I am. And so it's another opportunity for students to show what they understand about a text in a new way. And so you can also invite students, if it's appropriate, for students to do this about themselves. And obviously this comes with some vulnerabilities, some risks, so this is something that you want to build a classroom community around before you try this out. But it's a great way to do that once you have that kind of a safe environment for students to share. And they get ownership of this, right? They get to decide how they represent themselves. I like that a lot. And there's the website down there, youthinkIdo.com. All right, we'll pause here a little bit if you have any questions.
So So feel free to tweet us or use the chat feature if you have any questions for our presenters.
Okay, well, keep going. All right, we're going to do a little transition here. So we're going to switch to media literacy, which has a lot to do with digital literacy in terms of how we receive media a lot these days, right? Through technology, through gadgets and tools. And so let me maybe start with what we mean by this kind of slide with a bunch of images on it. So on the top left corner, you'll see how we deal with literacy conventionally in the English classroom. Right? There's a book. There's an essay about the book, presumably. And not to disparage you know, that kind of literacy or print-based literacy. These are obviously important that students know how to write, that they know how to read those kinds of texts. So let's make sure we're clear on that. But the way we receive messages in our daily lives is a deluge of multimodal and media integrated, image integrated text. And so we try to represent that through the rest of what's on this slide. So on the top right, you'll see paintings, photographs, images of various kinds. They also convey meaning. They're also structured in a certain way. I think our visual literacy, the next webinar will deal with that in particular. I'm fascinated by that conversation. I think it belongs in the ELA classroom simply because I believe in sort of a larger idea of what counts as a text, right, and what conveys meaning. And then across the bottom of the page, right, this is how meaning is conveyed through our cultural mechanisms. We don't even have a space really in our curriculum to talk about moving images, to talk about film and TV and images that that are strung together through time, right? Which are so such a big part of our culture, such a big part of how images or messages are conveyed in our world. But we don't have really a class or part of the curriculum. We get bits and pieces of it, perhaps. We don't really talk systematically about how text and image and graphics and arrangement on the page, even for still kinds of texts, convey meaning. I think that's really part of what we could be doing as English teachers. And then on the bottom left, well, we know all about the controversies of fake news and how that's become a new thing again with the internet, how we receive information. So this is news literacy, we might call it, is increasingly important that we revisit and talk about in a digital space. Okay, and just as we did before with digital literacy, I think we both think it's helpful to have a framework.
Definitely. Students need to understand that there is a point to what you're trying to get them to. And once they have that, my students look at these 5 questions all the time. We look at visual literacy in conjunction with analysis, rhetorical analysis. And so I put these questions up in front of them all the time, and it changes the conversation in the classroom. Definitely.
I really like having this support, right? This is it's a heuristic, right? It's a way of making sense of something that we're looking at or thinking about. Okay, we have a set of exploratory questions that can help us ask critical-minded questions about what we're analyzing, and then accompanying that on the other side of the page, the assumptions, right? And this is something that, to me, it's vital that we help students understand these assumptions, that these messages don't just happen, that they're constructed. They're constructed with people who have an agenda. Maybe they're trying to sell us something. Maybe they're trying to convince us of some political point. Maybe they're trying to influence us in some way. And if we don't ask these kinds of questions about these texts, then we're maybe not fully aware of what the intent is behind them. Okay, so with media literacy, what do teachers actually do? What are some examples?
One of the biggest things that I do in my classroom is I require students to go out and search for an article or a news story that they're interested in so that they can come into class and discuss it. And I force them to look at the opposite side. So they cannot come in every time with something they agree with. They have to come in with something they disagree with. They have to come in with something that they don't necessarily care either way, so that we can navigate what that piece of text is doing, where the biases are. And I do that from the very beginning of the year because they come in with this assumption that bias is negative, and sometimes bias is not negative, but you have to be able to navigate your own bias, the bias of the text, and the bias of the students in the classroom that you're working with.
Yeah, that seems to be a piece that we haven't really talked about enough as teachers. You know, we teach students to try to assess the credibility of a text, right? How do I know I'm looking at real research, you know, when I'm doing my research paper? So we teach them things like, okay, well, is it an authority? Is it written by an expert? And so on, which are sort of cognitive ways to think about a text. The affective, though, about our biases, are especially important when we're dealing with stuff that touches on our identities or our political affiliations or how we see ourselves in the world. And so if you're coming across an article on your social media feed that just confirms every bad thing you think about a particular politician, you know, to step aside and say, well, wait a second here, am I just confirming my biases, right? And that's why I like this, or is this legitimate?
Yes.
Right? It's difficult to do.
Yeah. Yeah, the students have started to call that filtered news, not fake news.
Filtered
news.
Yeah.
I thought that was
good.
cute.
And when we think of that, there are teams of people who are creating distorted stories for a political agenda, right, out there. Then if that becomes apparent to us, then we can see the sort of the frame around these what purportedly is news. Okay, so here are some examples of what I've tried to do in the work that I do with teachers in moving into this direction. Okay, how do we ask these critical questions about multimodal or media texts, right? And again, this is not necessarily new. A lot of teachers use print advertisements, for instance, when they're doing a unit on logos, ethos, and pathos, and help students grapple with how meanings are presented to you through images and text or the combinations thereof. I've tried to move a little bit towards, all right, let's look at some 30-second commercials. And this is kind of a challenge because we're so used to looking at something and then moving on very quickly to something else. Okay, I get it. It's a car commercial. I get it. It's a sports drink commercial. So part of what you have to do here is go back and look at the text over and over. And you have to develop a kind of patience with the text to say, there's more to be seen here, there's more to pay attention to, there's more to ask questions about.
And students will fight back against that. They're like, how do you know that this is what they mean? And it's not about what it means, it's about what you're what you're receiving back. So it's a hard conversation to have with them. But once they get it, they complain that they can't get it out of their heads.
Yeah, and that's good. We want them to be more complex people, to be more complex thinkers about these kinds of texts. And you know, I like to bring up, look, these are industries. Advertising is an industry that is designed to get you to think a certain way and to associate in a certain way with a product. And if they can get you to do that and not think too much about it, about how that happens, then that's their goal, right? And so if I point this out, that people get paid a lot of money to put these together in teams, it's not an accident. Everything is vetted, everything is intentional. And so if we start with products they're familiar with or that really try to locate identity within them. And so if we look at snack foods or sports drinks, stuff they're familiar with. Car commercials kind of because they convey a certain lifestyle or way of being in the world if you have this product. This truck helps you identify with a certain way of living in the world, or this car does the same thing. Right? In preparing students to think about these kinds of texts, They're not going to just do that automatically with your urging, you know. So this is kind of a support, right? A graphic organizer, if you will, that will help them as they repeatedly look at a 30-second commercial. And it's a lot easier to do than it used to be with tools like YouTube, right? We can just look at a commercial over and over again and stop it and point out things and talk about, well, why did they do this here, and what was their intent here, and why is this a purposeful choice? And we can focus and break it down in these elements to talk about the text for these particular aspects. Here's another example. Had some success with this kind of approach. And this gets to weaving in scenarios as well. And so let's take 1984, pretty canonical text in high school classroom. So we might ask students to think not only about what's going on within that text, so that we conventionally do as we analyze it and talk about it, but also let's think about how book covers represent what the story is about. And so you can just do a Google image search for classic books like 1984, To Kill a Mockingbird. Any text that's been around for a long time will have many different variations of a cover. And so there's a lot of things you can do with that. You can ask students to think about, of this selection of book covers, which one do you think is the most effective based on certain criteria? Okay, which one do you think is the most effective in conveying the themes of the book, what the book is about? Maybe which one do you think is most effective for appealing to young people to get them to read the book? And so you can also embed that in a scenario of some kind and say, all right, well, you're part of a team that's going to market this book. Which is the cover that we're going to choose because it's going to make a difference with how many copies we sell? Which one, based upon your goals as an editorial team or a marketing team, which one of these would you select and why? And why wouldn't you select the other ones and why, right? We're getting to that piece of explaining your rationales. I like this a lot because to me it's what we would call, I guess, real world. That there are multiple possible solutions, and it's really about how you argue. It's really about your pitch and the case that you make.
Yeah, such a life skill.
Yeah, it's kind of how it is in the world. And there isn't a right answer. There's a better argued answer.
Yes, supported with evidence from the image.
Here's another kind of version of this, and so in this situation, we looked at a particular piece of text in Romeo and Juliet, Juliet's monologue in this scene, and we had a series of questions here that asked us to think about, okay, of these images, and there are some that are still images taken from various interpretations of the play, various stage performances, and then we also have a video clip. Which of these do you think conveys the scene best and gets at some of the character and thematic elements? And again, you have to, if you're a student, you just don't pick one. You have to create a rationale, right? Explain. This is where it's at. There are a lot of opportunities here to grapple with texts that exist in the world. I really like this idea of how companies redesign their logos and why they do that. It's so expensive to go with a different logo that this is not a decision that's randomly made. It's got to go through various committees within a company, through various iterations of what the logo is going to change to, what is conveyed through this new logo. And so we can try to recreate those conversations that happen with students and ask them, okay, well, what was the team thinking? Why did they change? And so these are 4 logos that personally I think should be redesigned for various reasons. That the Sherwin-Williams logo has always cracked me up. Over the earth with paint.
Red, white, and blue.
Yeah, and so take a look at this next slide here. And so this is kind of the support that we might offer students. If we were to say, look, you're on the CVS or the Sherwin-Williams team that's going to redesign the logo, right? Let's look at how other logos, corporate logos, were redesigned previously and try to derive maybe some of the conversations or some of the values that the company was hoping that their customers or that the public would associate with their company, right? And so We don't know the conversations that took place for these, but we can try to, based upon the images, try to arrive. We can make a speculation, an informed speculation about what they were trying to do when they transformed these logos. And so, staying on this page, I've had students go through this work and really come up with some interesting logo redesigns based upon, well, we're trying to make our brand more accessible to people or more eco-friendly to people. And so they pitch the idea, they present their argument, just as you might do on an actual team that's doing this professional work. Other options are sports logos, which also go through a similar process of redesign, either because they become old-fashioned or stereotyped, or because they don't do what they perhaps want to do. So we might also take a look at, well, how sports logos changed over the years in particular, from one to another, and what do they convey at each of those stages? Why were they changed? What were the goals? I think this is a great way to get students involved who are perhaps not so charged up about conventional text analysis.
Definitely the males in the classroom, and some of my biggest sports fanatics are males in the classroom, would really get into this as a visual text to read.
And we can also move into spaces that are a little more critical, right, and helping students realize that they have a voice, that they have power within that voice to make a cultural or critical statement of their own. They can talk back to power, right, through their moves, especially with images and with media. So in this case, here's an example. The World Cup soccer tournament in 5 years will be in Qatar. There are laborers from other countries. They're building the soccer stadiums as we speak. There's been a lot of controversy about the processes by which this is happening. The laborers who are brought over from other countries are poorly paid. Their passports are confiscated. The working conditions are dangerous. Many people have already died. They're already predicting that almost 5,000 will die by the end of the project. I mean, this is, I think we'd all agree, probably a terrible situation. Nevertheless, there are many famous corporate sponsors and advertisers who are involved in the World Cup, right? And so what would push back to try to encourage corporate sponsors to help alleviate this condition? This is a kind of social activism, right? And so here are some corporate sponsors, big companies, right, who are involved in the World Cup, who are partners in some ways with the World Cup. And so here are remixes, right? And these might be a little shocking, right? To see, okay, well, how do we push Coca-Cola to make a statement about this and help change the conditions, right? Here's another one. How do we help McDonald's realize the trouble over there and use their leverage, use their power to help make the situation better for people who are powerless, the laborers who building those stadiums. Okay? And I think this appeals to young people who have a sense of social justice.
Social justice is huge, right? with you, definitely.
And here's a way that you can be voiced, right? And you can make a statement on things that you think are important. So overall benefits and relevance of this work, aside from the fact that it operates with the kinds of texts that are part of our lives in general, day to day, that are increasingly part of how we use gadgets like smartphones, how texts are conveyed to us and are used to convey different messages. Apart from all that, we can put these texts to work for us to help achieve these academic ends, right? Where we want students to be certain kinds of thinkers, creative thinkers, critical thinkers, willing to engage with complex arguments that are created multimodally, and to do these kinds of high-level, complex thinking acts, right? And you know, we bolded down there, seeing writing as an applied and useful tool, right? And both in analyzing how these texts work in the world, but also in creating their own texts as well, effectively and ethically. We included a link over there. Some of you may know the name Frank Baker. He's big in media literacy. He has a resource website, and he speaks out often about the importance of media literacy. And part of media literacy is the concept of news literacy, and we've already talked a little bit about that, right? And this importance of how we assess credibility and how do we self-assess our own biases.
So my students began the year individually coming in with an article that they found based on our theme. We were looking at the American Dream at the time. They had to find something that connected to the American Dream, and it had to be different each week. So each week it had to be a different bias. They could not just sit with their own belief, and they really had to challenge where they were going. So that in a Socratic seminar type of circle, we could discuss and we could test those assumptions and push each other to, why do you believe that? Where does it say that in the text to back you up? And thinking about bias and where it comes from. And that evolved into our debates as we got further into the year, and now they're ready to start writing their AP Lang style essays and arguing on their own, but they still have to think about that other side all the time so that they're arguing with or against that other side. And often they would come in prepared, and I'd flip it on them and make them argue the other side. They had to be prepared. They had to know that that's where they were going, and it was a challenge. They were nervous, but each time, even if I love it at the end because they would say, I have to tell you, I don't believe anything I just said. And I'm like, that's good. You argued it well. Nobody knew that you had to clear that up at the end. But it really pushes students to take news that is relevant to their world, examine what it says, examine what it means to themselves, and how someone else might see it differently. It really pushes them to look a different way.
I like that idea. We use this word ethically a couple of times through this webinar. And what Heather is kind of getting at here, what these students are doing, is really trying to find common ground with people who may think differently than you do, rather than othering people who have different beliefs. Yes. Right? Where do we share the same assumptions? How can I understand how you may have a different perspective on this than I do, and respect that difference. All right, I think we're going to pause here for questions. I think we're almost to the end, so this may be kind of a wrap-up, a summative questions. We barely touched on.
It was skimming it.
Yeah,
there's a lot there.
Just skimming through. There's just so much to talk. I find it to be a really rich area, both digitally and with image-integrated texts. Attracted to talking about those texts with students. What's possible.
So again, feel free to use the chat feature or Twitter to ask our presenters any questions you may have, any wonderings. Lots of kudos to
yeah, that's great. That's better than the alternative. This was a boring seminar.
So we'll have our colleague, Dee Dee Bunn, come back and just make some connections for us to UDL.
This was not a boring seminar, I will say. Webinar. I will absolutely say that. It had me thinking a lot over there about all of the things that you were talking about and how wonderful they are for getting kids involved and thinking about what they're doing and looking at it critically. All of the things that they're talking about really pull kids in and engage them. Everything that they were saying, I could just pull in engagement. And I like the idea that when you talked about it of learning with the students, and the idea that you had of rather than you finding a tool, that you would often send them out to find tools, because that really does get them involved. It gets them motivated, it gets them engaged, it gets them critically thinking about the things that they're going to be using. So, because there's so much technology out there, and some of it is great and some of it is not so great. It just depends upon what you have out there. But all of the things that you talked about in the area of engagement are really right there. I'm going to kind of put together the representation and the action and expression, because many of the things that you talked about are useful in both of those areas. They really do flow over words. You know, when you talked about the print-based literacies, and now that things are changing with technology and the internet, it's not just text anymore. It's looking at digital things. It's looking at videos. It's looking at graphics. It's looking at audio. All of these different modalities that we can use to have kids express what they know. And all of these different modalities that we can use to represent that material so that they can grasp that knowledge. You know, we have kids that don't do well with print-based. You know, and but if they see it, if they see a video, or if they hear something about it, then they're able to grasp that. You know, when you were talking about blogs and memeing and masking and moding, I was like, okay, I don't know many of these things.
It's okay.
You know, I'll need to learn what they are. Although when you showed the examples of memes, I was like, oh, I've seen many of those. Yes, so, you know, I knew what they were. But using these technologies, they can have, you know, you can have kids put things together for project-based learnings or ways that they express their knowledge. So the examples that you had of Romeo and Juliet, that one did a blog, one did a podcast, one did a video, a print-based type of thing, and another did a video. You know, all of those are different ways, and the way that you talked about evaluating those, that was one of the things I was thinking about when you're designing your lesson plans and you're looking at all of these different modalities. That may be something that you want to think about, is how are you going to assess that? What concepts are you looking for when you have these students that will come in with all of these different ways to explain what they're learning? That's something that you might want to think about as you're building your lesson plan. It's not just the information and the assessment, but the assessment. You want to bring that in. I got tickled when you were talking about Google Drive, that you use Google Drive at Kennesaw area, and I thought Google Drive is so wonderful. You know, it has so many different things on it that allow kids to collaborate, but it also has extensions and apps that provide them with supports they need if they're not able to. And you can find that not just on Google Drive. You can find it on any internet-based thing. There are always text-to-speech readers out there. There are always things that will caption for you so that you can get the print if you have problems with hearing. You know, all of those types of things. But looking at those when you're looking at the needs of your students, are those supports available for their kids if they're going to be using that different kind of technology that's in there? You know, when you talk, the sample that you talked about, that was, I've already mentioned it, was the Romeo and Juliet sample. I really liked when you started talking about getting them to look critically at logos, getting them to look critically at how they can state that, and especially the Qatar example where you talked about the way visually kids could represent what they're thinking about it, and getting corporations more involved. You know, those were two really nice ways to get kids to show what they're thinking, where they may be not able to voice it or put it in print, but they can do it graphically. You know, and get those same concepts that they're doing there. Using those various images to represent, that can be, you know, talking about the Burger King, you know, changing how they change their logo, or Walmart, how they change their logo, or SunTrust, how they change their logo. You know, you might have one child that can really communicate with the sports logos, you know, because your guys love sports logos. You know, my brothers are like that. They're able to do that, whereas you might have another child that goes toward another type of logo. And then they're able to use those to represent their own thoughts and what they're doing in that. So there's all kinds of different ways that you can do that, and all of the strategies that you talked about, all of those can fit very nicely in those principles of representation and action and expression. They really do flow over. So great job. I really enjoyed listening to this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your comments. It really integrated with the themes we were talking about.
Well, thank you. So.
Okay. So as you prepare to leave us today, we invite you to take advantage of a bonus webinar that was developed by Georgia Public Broadcasting and Discovery Education. They created this to complement our digital literacy session. And in the webinar, they'll walk you through a wealth of free digital resources that are offered to all of our Georgia teachers, from virtual field trips to videos and articles connected to science and social studies standards. So there'll be a link on our GSO site, and we just invite you to take advantage of these resources as you plan instruction for your students. And again, we thank you today for joining us for the 6th session on digital literacy. And we want to thank our presenters who have given their time and knowledge to our project. And as you prepare to leave us, remember that the follow-up professional learning has a twofold purpose. 1, to guide implementation back in your respective classrooms, and 2, to provide consistent implementation across the state. We encourage everyone to complete the session survey that will be emailed to you following today's live session, and we ask that our Tier 2 and Tier 3 facilitators please forward the survey link to participants in your PLC. Lastly, be sure to stay tuned for next month's K-612 session, on visual literacy. This session was created in partnership with the High Museum, and using vivid artwork from the museum, participants, you'll explore inquiry-based teaching strategies to support students with the process of observation and analysis as they read art like a text. And you do not want to miss this engaging session facilitated by Kelly York of Metro RESA. So again, we thank you. It's been our pleasure to offer you these live interactive webcasts, as we really, really enjoyed the collaborative conversations, and we would like for the conversation to continue on Twitter. So don't forget to use the hashtag Culture of Writing at Godot ELA. Happy writing.